All right, well, good evening, everyone. Oh, let's try it again. Good evening, everybody. Oh, that was much better, much better. Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Ryan Owens. I am the director of the Institute for Governance and Civics here at Florida State. I want to welcome you. Thank you for being here. I'm excited for our guests this evening. I think we're going to learn a lot about the Constitution and about our framers. So, the state of politics, well, it stinks these days. So I thought maybe we'd lighten it up a little bit before we begin with just a couple of jokes here. So what is the difference between death and taxes? Death and taxes. Congress doesn't meet every year to make death worse. But maybe they do, I don't know. Why do thieves never target politicians? Professional courtesy. Professional courtesy. All right. Well, look, I said this last speaker we had out here, I'm going to say it this time, I'm going to say it again and again and again. James Madison once wrote that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. I think he was right. So here at the IGC, we aim to build civic awareness, civic community, and a respect for constitutionalism. Now, we undertake that in a host of different ways, including snacks in the back. If you haven't availed yourselves of them yet, feel free throughout to go up and grab some snacks. But in all seriousness, we are working very hard with departments and units across campus here at FSU to hire faculty who are mission fit, consistent with our goals to improve civic awareness, civic community, and constitutionalism. For the students here who are in the room, you can check out our website, igc.fsu.edu. You can see some of the student essay competitions we have. We're awarding thousands of dollars in prizes for folks who will go and read some books on the Constitution, analyze them in our competition. We're trying to incentivize good behavior. So check that out, igc.fsu.edu. We're also hosting a number of events like this upcoming. We've got Charlie Cook and Alexander Cesis who are here. They're going to talk in the law school on March 19th about misinformation and the First Amendment and how those two can come into conflict and how we navigate that space. Beth Akers from the American Enterprise Institute will be here to talk about the economics of higher education. On April 5th, Jess Bravin and Molly Hemingway will be here to talk about the Supreme Court today. April 7th, Glenn Lowry will be here talking about the case for black patriotism. April 16th, we have a fantastic debate. Marcy Hamilton and Denise Harley will be talking about religious liberty at the Supreme Court today. You won't want to miss that. And then finally, next fall, we've got a lineup with some fantastic speakers who will be talking about one of the lesser-known founders, Gouverneur Morris. I think that's going to be a really interesting event. So for more information, check out our website, or you can follow us on social media. So thank you again to our Associate Director, Leela Siegel, for putting this together, folks within the IGC as well, Jonas Goldstein, Hillary Harbauer, Max Harden, and Grant Berkman, fantastic students who have worked really hard to make this happen. Our leadership here at FSU is phenomenal as well. We're very, very pleased to be working with Jimmy Cole within University Relations, President McCullough, and Provost Clark. So let's get to our guest of honor. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He's also a professor of law at George Washington University and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. Rosen's new book, which many of you got to see and get signed, The Pursuit of Happiness, explores how classical writers on virtue inspired the lives of our founders and defined America. He will talk to us tonight about that. Mr. Rosen will speak until roughly 6:30. At that time, we can ask him questions. We will sit down here in front of you, and we'll have a moderated Q&A. Here's how the Q&A will work. As you came in, you probably saw some pens and some note cards. There are some in the back as well at that counter. If you would like to ask Mr. Rosen a question, feel free to grab one of those cards, write your questions down on it. We've got students who are going throughout here. We got Max Harden and Grant Berkman in the back. If you want a card, just feel free to raise your hand. They will notice you. They will come bring you a card and something to write on it. They will collect those and bring them up here to me, and I will ask Jeffrey Rosen those questions. So we will conclude at 7 o'clock. and I am very happy to introduce our guest, Jeffrey Rosen. Jeffrey, come on out.
Hello, friends. It is wonderful to be here. It was so great to spend time with you and to learn about your incredible stories, to hear about all the passion there is here for learning about history and civics and the Constitution, and to meet you. I'm so glad to be here to tell you about the unusual COVID-era reading project that led me to explore what Thomas Jefferson and the other founders meant when they put those inspiring words in the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness. And what I learned during COVID changed my life. It changed what I think about how to be a good person, how to be a good citizen, how I spend my mornings, and it's turned me into a missionary for the transformative power of daily deep reading. So here's the story. It was during COVID, and I'm going to walk around if I may. It's during COVID that I noticed that both Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin had chosen as their motto for self-improvement projects that both of them devised a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And here's how I made this unexpected connection. I was rereading the part of Ben Franklin's autobiography where he describes how in his 20s he resolved to achieve moral perfection. And he made a list of 12 virtues that he later expanded to 13. Temperance, prudence, cleanliness, resolution, order. He saved the one he found hardest for last, humility. Ba-dum-bum. And he made a chart, and he put the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis, and resolved every night to focus on practicing a different virtue and to put an X marks in the box when he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it's incredibly depressing because there were so many X marks, and he gave it up after a while, but he felt he was a better person for having tried. I knew about this project because a friend and I had practiced it a few years ago in Washington, D.C. at the suggestion of our local rabbi without realizing that it came from Ben Franklin. It turned out there was a Hasidic rabbi in the 18th century who admired Franklin and translated his virtues into Hebrew. And this system is still practiced today by Jewish people who are seeking character improvement or seeking to improve their lives. It's called Musar, which means character in Hebrew. So without knowing that it was basically the Hebrew version of Franklin's 13 virtues, my friend and I tried it. We put an X mark every night where the virtue, we fell short of the virtue. We found it's incredibly depressing. There were just X marks all over the place. And we also gave it up after a while, but we thought we were better for having engaged in this exercise of self-reflection and self-improvement. So I knew about the project, but I hadn't seen the motto before. And Franklin's motto for the project was from Cicero, and it was, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the UVA campus. Jefferson everywhere, the founder of the university. On the wall of the hotel room was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters. And they're very similar to Franklin's. They include resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. So I knew about Jefferson's system, but what I didn't know before is that when Jefferson was asked to illustrate it and to explain the core meaning of happiness, he would send a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. And it was longer than Franklin's excerpt. It said, he who's achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the calm and self-possessed man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man. So I thought, okay, this book by Cicero was so important to both Franklin and Jefferson in defining happiness, and how striking it was that both of them defined happiness not as feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. So I thought, I've got to read this book by Cicero, but what else to read? Then I came across this golden reading list that Jefferson drafted, and he would send it to kids who were going to law school or to people, his friends, who asked him how to assemble a private library. And the book is the list is absolutely remarkable. You can find the long list on Founders Online, which is this amazing resource of all the papers of the Founding Fathers. And I excerpted in the Happiness book that some of you have. And the list was inspiring both for the breadth of the books and also for the schedule that Jefferson prescribes. The breadth is remarkable. It includes political philosophy and history and literature. Jefferson was a great reader of novels and ancient history and science and poetry. And what caught my eye was the section on moral philosophy. And sometimes Jefferson called it ethics and sometimes natural religion. And at the top of this list of 10 books was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. It was like a golden key kind of inviting me to read the rest of the list. And then Cicero's On Duties, and then a bunch of other books by classical moral philosophers, including Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Epictetus, Seneca's Letters, and then some Enlightenment philosophers, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Hume, Bolingbroke, and Algernon Sidney. And what struck me about this list is that I had not read any of the books on it. And I have had a marvelous liberal arts education, and I am so grateful every day to the wonderful teachers of English, government, history, political philosophy, and law that inspired me in college. I met one of you as also an English and government major, as I was, and I'm so glad that I studied English and American literature, and it just kindled me this love of the humanities. And then I continued the quest in grad school and law school, but I hadn't read these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum when I was in college in the 80s. And I remember when I was in college yearning for this kind of guidance about how to lead a good life. The 80s, as some of you will remember, were the greed is good decade. Gordon Gekko, you do you. It was, kind of get it all for yourself, following on the me decade of the 70s. And I was looking for an alternative to the hedonism and materialism that are basically celebrated by popular culture, and for guidance about how to lead a good life by reason and reflection rather than simply by authority or by pleasure seeking. And what I didn't realize, because these great books had fallen out of the curriculum, even though they used to be at the centerpiece of the curriculum for middle school, high school, college, and law students for much of American history, I didn't realize that this is exactly the question the ancient philosophers had set out to answer. What also really inspired me about Jefferson's list was his schedule. He said you've got to get up every morning before dawn, spend 2 hours reading moral philosophy, watch the sunrise, then breakfast, then ancient history and political philosophy, then lunch, then science and other mathematical investigations, then dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and light poetry for mild amusement, and then to bed 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I really don't know what got into me. It was COVID, we had more time. I thought I've got to read these books. So I tried a version of Jefferson's schedule, not the whole day, but I did wake up every morning before dawn. I read the moral philosophy for an hour or two. I watched the sunrise, and I found myself writing sonnets summing up the moral philosophy, which I know sounds incredibly weird, and I'd never written sonnets before, but there was something about this beautiful wisdom that just kind of called out to be summed up in sonnet form, just so I could, it was sort of like taking notes, but just so I could feel like I got the essence of it. And then I found out that all sorts of people in the founding era would write sonnets about this moral philosophy. It just blew my mind that Alexander Hamilton wrote some sonnets. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet, the great Phyllis Wheatley, wrote brilliant and inspiring sonnets of virtue based on the moral philosophy. And John Quincy Adams, another one of my heroes, would wake up in the White House, read Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, which turns out to be his favorite book, as well as the Bible, write sonnets, and walk along the Potomac. So was. I did that for a year, and as I said, what I learned changed my life. I learned that for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. But I also learned how to practice this path of spiritual mindfulness in a practical way. Much of the wisdom can be traced back to Pythagoras, who is the founder of Greek moral philosophy. Who knew? I didn't, before doing this reading, that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, if that weren't enough, Pythagoras was also a great sage who lived on the Isle of Croton. He insisted on rigorous moderation in eating and drinking, constant exercise. His motto was, "Reverence thyself." And he encouraged his disciples to live, first be good and then be like a god. In other words, seek the perfection of the divinity. And Pythagoras divided the soul into three parts: reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and said our task each day should be to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions so we can achieve that calm tranquility that the ancients believed defined virtue and happiness. Once I read Pythagoras, I could understand in a new light Aristotle's famous definition of happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics. In the Ethics, he defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. Because those terms are not self-defining, I never really knew what that meant. But then I read it through Pythagoras, and then suddenly I could understand the chart at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle has this chart of the passions. And remember, the Greek word for passion, pathos, is emotion. And Aristotle says for each passion or emotion, there's an excess and a deficiency. So we seek not exuberance or insensibility, but moderation. And it's all about the golden mean, all about moderation. That's why the classical virtues, temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, all have to do with achieving the golden mean. And the golden mean is not some mushy compromise or insensibility. It's not some milquetoast thing. It's a rigorous, daily, hourly effort to master yourself, to achieve self-mastery, self-discipline, self-improvement, character improvement. Today we'd say being your best self, using your reason to moderate your unreasonable passions. That reason-passion distinction comes up everywhere. It's in the moral philosophy and in the literature and in the books and in the Federalist Papers. Suddenly I understood what Madison was talking about when he defines a faction as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. It's Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I had the honor of knowing and interviewing, told me that her mother told her to avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear so you can achieve that focus that will allow you to be your best self and serve others. And I thought that was a very practical way to put it. So you see, the point isn't to lack emotion, but to control ourselves, to control our emotions so we can achieve a productive focus rather than unproductive perservations of the mind, or perturbations of the mind, which Cicero says we're supposed to still. It's really can be summed up by the Stanford marshmallow test. Some of you may remember that in the 70s, these researchers at Stanford gave very young kids who were 5 or so a choice. If they wanted if they demanded a marshmallow immediately, they'd get 1. If they could wait for 15 minutes, they would get 2 marshmallows. And the kids who could wait did much better later in life. They were did better in school and better in their careers because they could maintain that focus and not get distracted by thinking unproductively about the past or the future, but just stay tuned in and devoted to productive work. I did word searches for reason and passion, and also for the pursuit of happiness. And one of the most incredibly exciting things about being a learner today, and in fact about living in this world, with all of its polarization, all of its political challenges, all of the distractions that we face, how marvelous it is to live in a world when all the books in the world are online and free and just waiting for us to learn from. When I was a kid, I think I told some of you that my favorite building in Washington is the Thomas Jefferson building of the Library of Congress. Because I remember going as a kid with my mom, really young, and being so full of wonder at the thought that all the books in the world were in that beautiful space. And now they're just online. All we need is the self-discipline to read them. And I'll now share with you that I have a simple takeaway from my unusual COVID-era reading project. Now, I'm not always catching the sunrise, although I try to, and do what I resolve when I decide to. But the main thing is when I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read a book. And it's a totally transformative life hack. I am, like many of you, addicted to these screens and just live on them. And when I wake up in the morning, I'm tempted to check my email or check the blogs or check the news, worst of all, which is the biggest of all distractions. And I'm just not allowed to swipe whatever it is right to the email until I've gone left to Kindle. And I do read on line because I'm just so excited that I can carry all the books around with me. And it's completely transformative. I now finished another book, which will be out in October, about the pursuit of liberty, how Hamilton versus Jefferson ignited the lasting battle over power in America. It's an account of how the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson are kind of through lines through all of American history, which I can't wait to share. And also just reading outside of your immediate projects or deadlines, it's just transformative. I've learned something new every day. And really, for the founders and the classics, the pursuit of happiness meant being a lifelong learner. It meant learning something every day, and especially as you get older. It's the most fulfilling thing imaginable. And in that sense, the founders were right that happiness means feeling good, and not immediate pleasure, but long-term self-improvement. Think of how you feel. I'll describe how I feel when I, binge on the news or on YouTube videos, or you just kind of feel like you've wasted time. And whereas when you read a book, even though sometimes you have to force myself to stay with it, it opens up entirely new worlds, and that's the reason, passion, distinction. So I've become a real evangelist for reading, and I think that reading, it's harder when you're in school, of course, you have your classes and your deadlines, but if you want a superpower, just a half hour a day to read outside your classes, it'll totally transform your life. And the books are all here. It's just marvelous. So that was my takeaway from my COVID project. The happiness book that you have set out to ask the question, how did the framers apply these lessons in their lives? And what I learned again was just transformative. They talk constantly about their efforts to be better people, to lead a good life, to master their anxieties and their, today we'd call them neuroses, and they were just as anxious as we are and just as fearful that they were making a total hash of things, wasting their lives or squandering their opportunities or not living up to their high ideals. And they talk about this in their diaries and in their letters. They're constantly debating it with each other. And it was just remarkable to see how relatable they all are in the sense of trying to be better people and wondering whether they're just not failing on every level. After telling Franklin's story, I tell the story of John and Abigail Adams. When they met, they'd both been reading Pythagoras and his self-accounting system, because it was Pythagoras who recommended that every night before bed, you've got to make a list of how you've done in achieving the virtues. So John and Abigail meet. What do they decide to do? They make a list of each other's faults. And I really want to stress that this is not a great dating strategy. And in fact, John Adams is, of course, the most vain and arrogant man of his age. He's constantly storming about the fact he's not getting enough credit for the American Revolution. He's mocked as his rotundity or his elective majesty. He's very arrogant. But Abigail soft pedals this. She says, well, you're so brilliant that some people might possibly find you intellectually intimidating. So he can take that, but his response with his usual grace is, well, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she responds with incredible self-composure, well, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman should not comment on a lady's posture. Excellent response. They go on to have one of the great intellectual, spiritual, romantic, and political partnerships of all of American history. Their letters are just so beautifully learned and rooted and candid. And they take out all of their passion for self-improvement on their oldest son, John Quincy Adams. I thought that having a Jewish mother could be challenging at times. It turns out that having a Puritan mother is even harder, because she was really tough on John Quincy Adams. She loved to quote the proverb, he who is slow to anger is greater than he who taketh the village, and is constantly enjoining him, use your powers of reason to moderate your unreasonable passions and emotions. Use your time better, basically be more perfect. And this creates in him a lifelong sense that he's not living up to his potential. And his diaries are the greatest diaries by many accounts ever kept by an American president. Check them out. The Library of America also just has a brand new volume of his inspiring other writings. And Quincy Adams writes in his diary, I think in his early 30s, a really striking entry. He's just turned down a US Supreme Court appointment. He is minister to St. Petersburg, and he writes in his diary that he was squandering all of his potential. He was spending too much time at the theater, drinking too much Madeira. He said, if only I had more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He set a very high bar for himself. But as it is, he's just making a hash of it. Nevertheless, he goes on to great achievement. Secretary of State from Monroe, writes the Monroe Doctrine, elected president in the contested election of 1824, and then he suffers two extraordinary setbacks and tragedies. He loses the re-election campaign to Andrew Jackson in 1828, and around the same time, his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. He had descended into alcoholism. He couldn't take the pressure of his dad always exhorting him to be perfect. Quincy Adams wrote a book called Letters from a Christian Father to His Son. Very inspiring meditations on the Proverbs, but it was just too much pressure for the son, and he jumped off a steamship and killed himself. And Adams is shattered. He's devastated and doesn't know how he can continue. He prays, he examines himself, and he resolves to spend a year rereading Cicero and the Bible. And that's when he rereads his favorite book, the Tusculan Disputations. I mean, just the synchronicities are extraordinary. And his favorite motto from the Tusculan Disputations, I plant for the benefit of future generations. It's that impulse control and delayed gratification. And based on his reading of the scripture, he concludes that Jesus had promised to free the captives, and this suggests that slavery is incompatible with the Bible as well as natural law. And this discovery converts him into the greatest white abolitionist of his age. He hadn't been a fervent abolitionist before his reading, but he resolved with the immorality and biblical curse upon slavery, resolves to fight it. He gets reelected to the House, the only American president to return to Congress. He denounces the gag rule forbidding the reading of abolitionist petitions on the floor of the House. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He votes against the Mexican War. He exclaims, no, and then he collapses on the floor of the House of a stroke. And as he's dying, he's carried to a couch. And his last whispered words are, I am composed. And he gets this from Cicero. Remember that quotation from Cicero that Jefferson would hand out? The perfectly self-composed person is he who has achieved virtue and lasting happiness. It's just this extraordinary symmetry of virtuous death for an extraordinarily virtuous life. So that's John Quincy Adams. John Adams and Jefferson reconcile, and when they reconcile, after they've written the Declaration of Independence together, then they fall out over politics. In the bloody election of 1800, among the most violent in American history, there's threats of secession and disunion. They, 10 years later, reconcile. John sends Jefferson a copy of Quincy Adams' lectures on rhetoric and on Cicero as a kind of reconciliation president. And then they start writing to each other, and what do they want to talk about among the most inspiring correspondences in all of American letters? Their joint quest for the pursuit of happiness. And it's talk about access to books. I am so inspired by the fact that these great old men, having founded the nation, mostly want to talk about the books they've read, in particular about spirituality. And John Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras, the founder of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas. And with his incredibly close reading, Adams notes that the central lesson of the Bhagavad Gita, renounce and enjoy, renounce attachment to controlling external events, and enjoy eternal salvation, is the same as the Stoic dichotomy of control, which says, don't try to control the thoughts or emotions of others, focus on the only thing you can control, which is your own thoughts and emotions. Again, among the best practical self-mastery advice you can possibly get. And Adams says, if only it can be proved that Pythagoras traveled to the East, we'll show this connection. And then he sums up all of the central moral teachings of the East and the West, including the Dhammapada, we are what we think, life is shaped by the mind, and the proverb that Abigail loved to quote so much. He sums it up in what he calls the hymn of Cleanthe, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. Just extraordinary and deeply moving and a deeply personal expression of Adams' spiritual creed. Jefferson responds that after a lifetime of reading and reflection, he's no longer a Stoic, but is now an Epicurean. But by that, he doesn't mean a hedonist or a wanton pleasure seeker. That's a libel on the Epicureans by the Stoics. In fact, the Epicurus, according to Jefferson, sought to regulate our desires and passions so that we could virtuously meet them. And that was his mature spirituality. That leads to the central and important question, what about Jefferson and slavery? And what about all of the enslaving founders and slavery? And how is it possible that Jefferson, who insisted on the centrality of virtue to happiness and of self-control to virtue and of industry and frugality to self-control, could himself own other human beings? And one thing I discovered is that he didn't even try. And all of the enslavers of that generation recognized the incompatibility of slavery and the Bible and natural law. And I found this really striking quotation of Patrick Henry just after he's given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech outside the State House in Richmond. It's a quotation from Addison's Cato. He was another classicist. Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." And that brutal moment of candor, I know it's wicked and immoral, but I like the lifestyle and I don't want to give it up, was shared by all of the enslavers of that generation. They knew it was wrong, but they just didn't want to give up the lifestyle. And no one more than Jefferson, who while preaching the virtues of industry and frugality, lived at Monticello like Caligula, like a Roman emperor. He was a shopaholic. He was constantly buying, gilded mirrors and tufted ottomans in France, and went into huge debt to satisfy his avaricious lifestyle. An irony, to say the least, for the man for whom the avoidance of debt was the centerpiece of his entire political philosophy. He says that the earth is held in usufruct for the living, and we've got to have a constitutional amendment every 19 years, a constitutional convention, because a current majority can't impose its will on a past majority, just as it can impose its debts on a past generation. And yet at the same time, he's living so beyond his means that when he dies, his entire estate has to be sold, including his enslaved population. And the only people who he held in bondage, who he freed on his death, are his own kids by Sally Hemings. And Sally Hemings agreed to come back from Paris only on the condition that Jefferson promised that he would free their kids when he died. And he kept that promise and freed their 2 kids. 2 others he'd allowed to escape years earlier. And then 3 members of the Hemings family, but no one else. And the rest of the whole, all the human beings who he held in bondage, parents were separated from kids, mothers from children, and the whole thing had to be sold because he was so far in debt. So it's a striking hypocrisy of the great prophet of freedom, but it is striking that he didn't try to justify it morally and saw it in these classical terms of his own avarice and addiction to this lifestyle that meant the fact that he was always insisting slavery should end, but at some point in the distant future that kept receding into the distant horizon. Contrast Jefferson with Washington. If Jefferson gets smaller on close examination in terms of his personal choices, Washington is larger. And he's so mindful and so self-composed, and this is what makes him the greatest leader of his age. Washington's most significant and fraught moment is at Newburgh in 1784. The troops are rebelling because Congress can't raise enough money to pay the soldiers. And there's talk of a coup in the air, and there's some soldiers who want Washington to set himself up as the head of a new military dictatorship. He resists these calls. He mounts a wooden platform at Newburgh called the Temple of Virtue. He has performed for the troops Addison's Cato, his favorite play, praising the calm virtues of mild philosophy. Washington has this performed for the troops to give them an example of calm moderation in the middle of when a coup is about to start. And then he mounts the platform and he appeals for calm and patience and temperance and prudence for the classical virtues. Basically says, just wait a little bit longer, please have some patience, and I'll ensure that Congress pays you. And then he goes to read this letter that a friend has written about Congress, and he famously puts on his reading glasses, he struggles to read the letter, and he says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown blind." And the soldiers weep because they've never seen him confess humility before. And this amazing moment of self-control and self-disclosure is the key to Washington's greatness and what gives him greater moral authority than anyone else of his age. At the end of his presidency, Washington warns that unless citizens find virtue, the republic will fall. He draws explicitly this connection between personal self-government and political self-government, and says that unless you can be temperate and prudent rather than attempting to descend into the factions that are beginning to arise as the new Democratic, Republican, and Federalist parties are arising, then citizens will be more intent on shoring up their candidates than on being devoted to the public good. And he also worries that they'll elect unvirtuous leaders who will flatter the people and surrender them to give up their liberties in exchange for cheap luxuries, the way Caesar did. And just as Caesar co-opted the Senate and then declared himself permanent emperor and subverted the republic, Washington fears that America too will go to demagogues and the mob. And he's not sure the experiment will succeed, and says the key is civic education. And he wants to create a new national university where people can come, set aside their regional and geographic differences, study the principles of the science of government, and learn the habits of civil dialogue and moderation that will allow them to keep the republic, which is why this great new Civics Institute that you're creating is so important. This is a version of the Washingtonian studies in the arts of civility and citizenship that he thought were so crucial. And he just doesn't know if the republic will succeed. Once I saw that direct connection between personal and political self-government, I could read the Federalist Papers in a new light. The Federalist Papers turn out to be a manual for public happiness, which is a phrase that comes up a lot. And Washington, in addition to defining faction as a group animated by passion rather than reason, has been reading a trunk full of books from Paris that Jefferson sent over about the failed democracies of Greece and Rome. And Madison says in Federalist 55, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. There's that reason-passion distinction. He's worried about Shays' Rebellion, the mob in western Massachusetts that's mobbing the federal courthouses because the farmers don't want to pay their debts. And he's setting up the entire constitutional system to slow down deliberation, to have speed bumps and roadblocks, to ensure that mobs can't mobilize, and by the time they do mobilize, they'll get tired and go home. And also that no single branch can speak for the people. We, the people, as a whole, are sovereign. We parcel out our power to different branches in order to ensure that the ultimate power resides in us. And Madison, who's an incredibly close student of political psychology, says that we've got to achieve the same harmony in the constitution of the state that we seek to achieve in the constitutions of our own mind. And he says, just as in the mind, following Pythagoras, we're supposed to balance reason, passion, and desire, so in the constitution of the state, reason in the Senate, I think it is, and passion in the House, and I don't know, maybe it's desire in the executive or something like that, has to ensure that calm moderation prevails. You're going to hear, your essay contests winners will get a copy of Yuval Levin's great new book on the Constitution, and Yuval Levin reminds us that the core of the Madisonian Constitution is moderation, contestation, and compromise, so that no branch can claim to speak for the people. And this is a direct channeling of classical moral psychology as well as classical political psychology. Aristotle's Politics recommends a separation of powers along with Polybius, but it's Aristotle's Ethics that recommends a separation of faculties in the mind. The symmetry is so beautiful, and I just didn't get any of this before reading the moral philosophy. So that's Madison. Okay, now let's wrap up and have a conversation. But we must note that so many of the structural features that Madison counted on to maintain this balance are under siege. First, Madison thought the large size of the republic would be a great cooling factor. Montesquieu had said you could only have republics in small places because everyone knew each other and could deliberate face to face. Madison says, no, if you have representation, you don't need to deliberate face to face. And the large size of the republic would mean that by the time mobs discovered each other, they would either never find each other or they'd get tired and go home. It basically would be really hard to organize mobs or factions over a large territory. In particular, Madison was keen on a new media technology, the broadside press, that allows complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers to be printed in newspapers and distributed across America, and citizens would read the Federalist Papers in their coffee houses, they'd discuss them with their representatives, and reason would slowly diffuse across the land, led by a new enlightened class of statesmen and journalists Madison called the literati. And he thought the literati would write their essays in the newspapers. You know, it's kind of like a 18th century version of the Atlantic or whatever, you know, and then the thoughtful statesmen would read these Atlantic essays or discuss the Federalist Papers with citizens who would never communicate directly with the president. The idea of a tweeting president is Madison's nightmare because the president's not supposed to appeal directly to the people, but by thoughtfully reading these essays written by the literati, reason would slowly diffuse across the land. Just to describe the Madisonian ideal makes it obvious how far we've come from it. In our current world, posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason. Social media is the antithesis of the republic of reason. Polarization and negative polarization. Remember, polarization is being attached to your own side, and negative polarization is being determined to destroy the other side. And that is not compatible with the Madisonian system of compromise and deliberation and reasoned civil discourse. And for all these reasons, we seem very far from the Madisonian ideal. Despite all that, I do want to end on a note of hope. as I said, it just blows my mind with wonder and excitement that we live in a world when all the great books and primary texts of the world are all online, and they're free. And then there are these wonderful resources where you can learn from them. And I've got to put in a plug for the National Constitution Center's incredible interactive constitution. I was so thrilled that some of you are using it. And Dr. Brandon's public health class, that's the most amazing thing you're doing. You're taking the interactive constitution and using that. I learned to examine current questions like COVID and the healthcare mandate. It's just brilliant. And I'm so moved and honored that the resources are useful to you and your great students who have a deadline tonight for a paper, so I can't go too much longer. But, as you know, there's essays by America's leading liberal and conservative scholars nominated by the Conservative Federalist Society and the Liberal American Constitution Society about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. And it just blows your mind. You have Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words about what they agree the habeas corpus clause means, and then separate statements about what they disagree about. And multiply that by 80 scholars and 160 clauses. It's just amazing. And then there are the podcasts that some of you are listening to, which bring together liberal and conservative scholars to debate the issue of the week. We just, 2 days ago in Miami, had Yuval Levin and Charlie Cook, who I think are going to be here, along with Melissa Murray and Ali Velshi and some liberal commentators, thoughtfully discussing all of the big, hard, complicated constitutional questions in the news, including the questions about the unitary executive and whether the Supreme Court will check the president and whether or not Congress is doing its job and whether or not we're in a constitutional crisis. And just hearing thoughtful scholars debate these issues from a constitutional, not a political perspective is very it's sobering. You learn a lot, and it can be slightly fortifying. At the end of our conversations, George Will said, "I know I'm not typically a ray of sunbeams, but I'm feeling moderately optimistic about the future," and that was helpful to hear, although some, disagreed. And then there are primary sources, and then there's this new Constitution 101 class that I've been pitching to you guys to check out for K through 12. It's incredible. It's for high school students. There's a version with Khan Academy with America's greatest constitutional scholars, Robbie George and Gordon Wood. It's just mind-blowing, all free, and we're trying to bring it to lots of kids. So there's grounds for hope, and most of all, many of you were asking, what can I do to lead a purpose-driven life? Just keep reading. Set aside that reading time. Read outside of your classes. There's nothing that will make you feel better than learning and growing and using your faculties to their utmost and developing your talents to the best of your abilities. It's a glorious thing to live in a world where we can do that every day, and I'm so glad to be here with you. Let's have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. So we've got some excellent questions here. I'm going to take this first one. Of all the writers that you discuss in your book, who do you believe to be the most influential?
I'll answer by saying that the most influential, I guess, was Cicero. It really is amazing how he was quoted by everyone, by both the Enlightenment sources like John Locke, who quotes him on the main page of his essay concerning human understanding, to the moderns. But if I had to recommend one, and maybe some folks will want to check them out, I would say Marcus Aurelius. His meditations are the most accessible. Get a good modern translation. Millions have found it to be great self-help advice. You read it, and there are a lot of aha moments. And Cicero is not exactly a romp, but a good translation of Aurelius. Everyone loves it, so check it out.
So here's a question that's near and dear to my heart. Would our founders be happy with an era of delegated congressional power and broad executive power?
Well, one thing we know is that the founders were resolved that the president would not be a king. That was the point of the American Revolution. And the Hamilton-Jefferson book notes, I'll just quickly tell the story. There's this great dinner party that defined America, not the one where They agree to move the capital in exchange for assuming the debt. A year later, the cabinet gathers at Jefferson's house in Philly while Washington's away. And Hamilton says, "Who are those guys on the wall?" And Jefferson says, "Those are my trinity of the greatest men in the world, John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Francis Bacon." And Hamilton blurts out, "The greatest man in the world was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson writes, "Hamilton's for a monarchy." And then a little later, John Adams says, "Well, if the British Constitution were purged of corruption, it would be perfect." And Hamilton says, "Purge it of its corruption and you'd lose what makes it perfect. As it is, it's the most perfect in the world." And Jefferson writes he's for a monarchy bottomed on corruption. Now, Ron Chernow thinks Hamilton was joking when he praised Caesar because he's always denouncing demagogues who will overturn the Constitution. But this is the campaign slogan for the foundation of the first political party in America. And Jefferson founds the Democratic Republican Party supposedly to prevent the monarchical Federalists from consolidating executive power. And that's the main debate over the rest of American history, the battle between executive rule by elites and democratic rule by Congress, between national power and states' rights, and between liberal and strict construction of the Constitution has defined all of our political parties and debates on the Supreme Court ever since. And the Hamilton-Jefferson book just traces this throughout American history. So and Hamilton was not for a monarchy based on corruption. And he believed in impeachment, and he was very keen on Congress checking the president. And both Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison, all of them, thought that Congress was going to be the most dangerous branch, sucking all power into its impetuous vortex, as Madison said, and the judiciary would be the least dangerous branch, to use Hamilton's famous words. So whatever you think of the unitary executive theory, and there's legitimate grounds for debate about that, and the Supreme Court may or may not embrace it in its full forms, and we can talk about some of those cases, I don't have any hesitation in saying all of the founders do not want the president to be a king. They are very keen, in fact, on checking the president and ensuring that all power is not in the president. So to the degree that, certainly not because of this administration, but over the course of the 20th century, executive power has vastly expanded in ways that the framers wouldn't have anticipated. And in particular, in 1912, when both Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt for the first time claimed that the president is a direct steward of the people channeling popular will, that's the opposite of what the framers want. So you have the new claims of the assertions of executive popular supremacy, combined with the new media technologies, combined with a shrinking Congress and an increasingly aggressive and emboldened judiciary. That's not the balance the framers had in mind.
So one of the questions that we've had here throughout is the discussion about virtue and how you become virtuous. It requires a lot of work, a significant amount of work. So we've had some questions about how, I don't want to say today's busy lifestyle, because today is just like any other day, right? But people are busy today. How can people become more virtuous if they don't have the time to invest in some of the activities you talked about before?
Make the time. Make the time. That is the takeaway. It's very, the takeaway is simple. For all of the founders, the most practical thing they did was waste no time. That was, Washington had that constantly in his thoughts. He was a big reader of Seneca's letter to Lucilius. "Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be." That famous line from Shakespeare is taken from Seneca. He has clocks everywhere. He dines at the same time. He does his work at the same time. Okay, we think we're busy. Well, first of all, we're not. We have central air conditioning, we have freezing, we have airplanes, we don't have to till the land. And the other thing is, you have to be, this is what it did for me anyway, really hyper-conscious about how you're spending every minute or every 10 minutes or every hour, and just that you're using it productively, not unproductively. And that includes what you're reading, and it's not reading, and it's not productive to be browsing. That's a total waste of time. And I'll just speak for myself. I think about the huge amount of time that I still waste every single day. If you can just create these habits of daily productive time, I can't believe I wrote this book. Like, just an hour or two a day, you can do a huge amount, and also every day, you know. And it's got to be a habit. That was Franklin and Pythagoras' other thing. So maybe it sounds scoldy or, you know, boring to say read every day, but really it'll totally change your life, and then it'll certainly takes away any excuse that we're all too busy. It's how you choose to use time, and being conscious of time is a great thing to do.
Yeah. I will say on my computer monitor up on the top, I have written up there, what are you doing to make it happen? You just need constant reminders to make sure that you're on task.
So true.
So a question that we got in here is, what is the value? Explain, if you could, the value to some of the students potentially here and why they should care about the founders. Why does this matter? We seem so far removed from it right now. Why should they care?
Well, first, because they're inspiring examples of how to live and how not to live. And we can learn as much from their mistakes and their failings as we can from their successes. But I find it incredibly inspiring by how much they read and how hard they worked to do their reading and how much they achieved purely by self-determination and deep reading. We also should learn about them because it's the essence of our system of government, and to understand what to think about this remarkable moment we're living in. Are we in a constitutional crisis or not? Is this an appropriate effort to deploy executive power on behalf of goals that the president's supporters share, or is it an attempt to subvert the system? You can't have an informed opinion about that unless you dig in deep, both to the primary sources and what the founders were trying to design and much else. In addition to all that, if that weren't enough, just as the incentive for citizens to learn about the founders, we live at a time when at the Supreme Court, at least many of the justices believe in a jurisprudence of original understanding. Some call themselves textualists, others originalists. There are important differences among them. But if you want to understand what the Supreme Court is doing, you've got to learn about the founders so that you can make up your own mind. And you must understand what the Supreme Court is doing, whether you're a lawyer or not. We have a right, but also a responsibility as citizens to inform ourselves about those Supreme Court decisions so we can make up our own mind. And that phrase, make up your own mind, comes up so constantly. Tacitus, Jefferson's single favorite author, out of all those great authors, his single favorite was the Roman historian Tacitus, who said, we have to think as we will and speak as we think. Louis Brandeis cited that along with Spinoza as the essence for the defense of free speech. You can't rely on someone else, a teacher or a preacher or a government official, to tell you what to think. You've got to decide for yourself, but that takes very hard work. It means you've got to read the primary text and read the Supreme Court decisions, read the majority opinions and the dissents. And to do that, you don't have to go to law school and don't be intimidated by the legal jargon, but you've got to at least be interested in the founders because that's what the justices are talking about. Plus, if that weren't enough, it's just so interesting. It's so riveting. It's so exciting. All of these stories, these great stories of men and women, and some we know and some we don't, who struggled and they were like us in so many ways and not in others. And history is a glorious adventure, and it's just great and exciting to learn about it.
So last question, unfortunately, we could go on much longer about this. We had some questions about civic education, and here we are at the Institute for Governance and Civics. What can you say about civic education and maybe what we need to do now to inculcate greater virtue among both those in K-12, but also students and folks who are here right now? Do you have any thoughts about how we can use civic education to accomplish a greater good?
Well, first, it's wonderful that you've created this important new institute, the Institute for Governance and Civics. You're bringing great teachers to teach the core principles of American governance, and I can just tell from talking to you guys what engaged, enthusiastic, committed students you have, so it's an honor to be here. Do just what you're doing, which is to teach history well, with all of its challenges and complexities, because it's always complicated. And telling the stories often inspires people to lead better lives. John Jay kept telling his kids, read Plutarch the biographies will inspire you to avoid the mistakes of the past and live up to the best ideals. I have the privilege of, for a lover of history, the greatest job in the world. I just can't tell you how incredibly privileged I feel every day to work at the National Constitution Center, this nonpartisan place full of wonderful colleagues who share a common passion to teach the principles of history and the Constitution across America. I get to travel and meet folks like you, and I can assure you, in every single state, people just like us are hungry to learn about the principles of America, free from the partisanship, getting past all these political debates, converging around what unites us, which is these principles. And lots of lifelong learners. It's just beautiful, and all over the place. My experience is the best way to really learn about history and civics is to take the politics out of it. We are not going to agree about politics. I don't see that it's productive to have debates about the political issues that are tearing the country apart, but we can absolutely have productive debates about the constitutional issues. And it's not intuitive that non-lawyers are supposed to debate the Constitution, or that kids starting as early as middle school can debate constitutional issues. But we found they can. We have our methodologies course. We're starting in middle school. You learn about originalism and textualism and the alternatives. I always encourage kids to read the majority opinion and the dissents. I was on a Zoom with a middle school recently, and one guy chatted, "I'm Bill, I'm 11, I'm not sure I can read the dissents, but I know you can do it." And you can. People always rise to the occasion. So for all the challenges, and for all, which are very serious, and of course we don't know how history will end. There are contingencies and fortune and fate, and there's much that's unknown. But I am really encouraged by the devotion to learn the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. It's all over America, and it's going to keep us together.
Well, thank you very much for this. Excuse me. The Pursuit of Happiness, Jeffrey Rosen's new book. It's fantastic. If you don't have a copy of it, you need to get one. The National Constitution Center is doing fantastic work. We love everything that you're doing there. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your motivating discussion about the founders and civic virtue. Thank you so much for being here. And would you all please join me in thanking Jeffrey Rosen for being here. Our next event will be on March 19th. Check us out at igc.fsu.edu. Thanks, everybody, and have a good night.